Elon, I, the Tetragrammaton, the Lord God Most High, I do exercise thee and do powerfully command thee, O Spirit. Elon, I, the Tetragrammaton, the Lord God Most High, I do exercise thee and do powerfully command.
In the dark shadows, in the white cold, fearlessly we search for knowledge new and old. We drink the strong spirits and read the ancient tomes. The order of the Abracast. We are the brave and the bold. Occult, history, conspiracy, and violence.
Welcome, friend. This is the Abracast. I'm your host, Dr. John Towers. We're continuing our look at The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin this evening. The theory behind this series is that I believe that we're going to be hearing a lot about the Federal Reserve in the coming, months, years, decades. And I didn't have a good understanding of it. So, I bought this book in a witch museum. And I've been chipping away at it ever since. So we're going to continue. Through here. I recommend this book. These sets of episodes are different because I'm not doing the whole book. This book is not in the public domain, so I'm hitting bits and pieces, ripping through it, jumping ahead, and so forth. That's not usually. I stay within books that are in the public domain, except for the Satanic Bible, I guess. But I'm like, yeah, sue me, Satanist. Like, it seems a bit hypocritical, but anyhow, that wasn't a challenge to any Satanists out there. So before we get started, you can hear that I need to lube up a little bit. I have my weapon of mass distraction, the formula of which was followed to a T and deposited within my vessel of the art. I will say a prayer over thee. May the Lord keep thee and preserve thee. And may, here's the women, here's the swimming with bow-legged women. Alright, well, how's this for getting right fucking to it? Monetary and political scientists continue to expound the theoretical merits of the Federal Reserve System. It has become a modern act of faith that economic life simply could not go on without it. But that the time for theory is past. The creature moved into its final lair in 1913 and has snorted and trashed about the landscape ever since. If we wish to know if it is a creature of service or a beast of prey, we merely have to look at what it has done. And after the test of all those years, we can be sure that what it has done, it will continue to do, or to use the biblical axiom, a tree shall be known by the fruit it bears. So let us now examine the harvest. The rise of the House of Morgan, Morgan's ties with England, and the House of Rothschild. The connection between the Federal Reserve System and the Bank of England, the Fed's decision to inflate American dollars to assist their ailing British economy. The period between the Civil War and the enactment of the Federal Reserve System was one of great economic volition, or volatility maybe, and no small measure of chaos. The National Banking Acts of 1863 and 1865 established a system of federally chartered banks which were given significant privilege and power over the monetary system. They were granted a monopoly in the issuance of bank notes, and the government agreed to accept those notes for the payment of taxes and duties. They were allowed to back this money up to 90% with government bonds instead of gold, and they were guaranteed that every bank in the system would have to accept the notes of every other bank at face value, regardless of how shaky their position. The net effect was that the banking system of the United States after the Civil War, far from being free and unregulated, as some historians have claimed, was literally a halfway house to central banking. The notion of being able to generate prosperity simply by creating more money has always fascinated politicians ad nauseum. See the 1970s. Look out your window right fucking now. But at no time in our history was it more in vogue than in the second half of the 19th century. The nation had gone mad with the Midas complex, a compulsion to turn everything into money through the magic of banking. Personal checks gradually had become accepted in commerce just as readily as banknotes, and the banks obliged their customers by entering into their passbooks just as many little numbers as they cared to borrow. As Close observed, the manna of cheap money became the universal cry, and as with the Israelites, the easier the manna was acquired, the louder became the complaint, the less willing the people to struggle for it. The prevailing philosophy of the time was aptly expressed by J. Cook, the famous financier who had marked the huge Civil War loans on the federal government and who now was raising $100 million for the Northern Pacific Railroad. Cook had published a pamphlet which was aptly summarized by its own title: How Our National Debt May Be a National Blessing. The Debt is Public Wealth, Political union, protection of industry, a secure basis for national currency. Why, asked Cook, should this grand and glorious country be stunted and dwarfed, its activities chilled, and its lifeblood curdled by these miserable hard coin theories? They must be theories of a bygone era. As it turned out, however, the chilling and curdling came not from a musty hard coin theory of the past, but from glittering, easy money theories of the present. The Northern Pacific went bankrupt, and as the mountain of imaginary money invested in it collapsed back into nothing, Cook's giant investment firm disappeared along with it, triggering the Panic of 1873 as it went. Matthew Josephson writes all about the failure of J. Cook. Newsboys hawked throughout the country. The largest and most pious bank in the Western world had fallen with the effect of a thunderclap. Soon, allied brokers and national banks and 5,000 commercial houses followed it into the abyss of bankruptcy. All day long in Wall Street, one suspension after another was announced. Railroads failed. Leading stocks lost 30 to 40 points or half their value within an hour. Immeasurable waves of fear altered the movement of greed. The exchanges were closed. The stampede, the greatest crisis in American history, was on. While 2022 turns and says, hey, hold my beer. Watch this shit. So at the beginning of this series, we talked an awful lot about booms and busts, and this is the way the boom and bust cycle, is the way it was designed. So they know when it's going to boom and they know when it's going to bust, so they can long and short it as normal. I watched a fascinating documentary. I can't remember what the fuck it was called, but it was all about the GameStop thing. And I'm like, finances, man. They're so fucking weird. Anyhow, it was a very bizarre story. I can't believe that some of the shit is legal for them to do, but now I know because of the creature from Jekyll Island. It's set up to be unethical. It's set up to be fucking crazy. Anyhow, here we go. Altogether, there were four major contractions of the money supply during this period, the so-called panics. 1873, 1884, 1893, and 1907. Each of them was characterized by an inadequate bank reserves and the suspension of specie payment. Congress reacted not by requiring an increase in the reserves, which would have improved the safety margin, but allowing a decrease. What the fuck is that all about? Sounds like something that's going on right now. Like, inflation's going crazy. Let's just print a bunch of money and send it to the Ukraine. Let's just print a bunch of money and send it to everybody. My twit governor right now, Governor Egghead in the People's Republic of Pennsylvania is out there talking about, hey, we're going to send everyone $2,000. It's going to be awesome, everybody. This is going to be great. That's the I'm not saying that Egghead is printing the money to send. Egghead is just the governor of Pennsylvania. But the government of Pennsylvania is so flush with money from the government that they're like, hey, we could really just give everyone a couple $1,000, man. It would be great. Imagine. They might vote for me again, even after killing all the old people in Pennsylvania during COVID. Where was I? In June of 1874, legislation was passed which permitted the banks to back their notes entirely with government bonds. That, of course, meant more fiat money for Congress, but it also meant the banknotes no longer had any specie backing them at all. Not even 10%. The release of over $20 million from bank reserves, which then could be used as the basis for pyramiding even more checkbook money into the economy. It became accepted mythology that these panics were caused by, guess what, seasonal demands, farm loans at harvest time. To supply those funds, the country banks had to draw down on their cash reserves, which generally were deposited with larger city banks. This thinned out the reserves and held in the cities. The whole system became more vulnerable. Actually, that part of the legend is true, but apparently no one is expected to ask questions about the rest of the story. You guys might be too young to remember Paul Harvey, but here's the rest of the story. Several of them come to mind. Why wasn't there a panic every autumn instead of just every 11 years or so? Why didn't each bank, country, or city maintain adequate reserves to cover their depositor demands? And why didn't they do this in all seasons of the year? Why would merely saying no to some loan applicants cause hundreds of banks to fail? The myth falls apart under the weight of these questions. The truth is that if it hadn't been seasonal demand by agriculture, the money magicians simply would have found another scapegoat. It would have been immobile reserves, lack of elasticity in the money supply, imbalance of international payments, some other technocratic smokescreen to cover the real problem, which was and always has been fractional reserve banking itself. The bottom line was that in spite of the elaborate scheme to pull minuscule reserves of country banks into larger regional banks where they could be rushed from town to town like a keg of coins, the old frontier, it still didn't work. The loaves of fishes stubbornly refused to multiply. Morgan prospers when others fail. The monetary expansion and contractions of this period were large waves that capsized thousands of investment ships at sea. There was one large vessel that somehow bobbed up and down with the surges quite well, and could be seen throughout the storm, salvaging the abandoned cargoes of those that were in distress. This vessel brought back to port untold riches that once had been the property of others, but now belonged to the master of the salvage ship in accordance with rules of the high sea. This captain's name was J.P. Morgan. It will be recalled from a previous section that Morgan and Company was no small player in the world chess match called World War I. Morgan had been chosen by the French and the British governments as the official agent to sell their war bonds in the U.S. when the war began to go badly for them. The Morgan interests began to aggregate for American entry into the conflict, a move which was calculated to save the loans. The loans! The Morgan firm was also the official U.S. trade agent for Britain in violation of international treaty. It handled the purchase of shipping to England all of the war material, including enormous cargo of munitions aboard the Lusitania when she went down. And not in a good way. The close relationship between Morgans and the Great Britain was no accident. J.P. Morgan Jr. was a driving force behind the Council of Foreign Relations, the American branch of the secret society established by Cecil Rose for the expansion of the British Empire. In truth, the Morgans were more British than American. The reasons for this is to be found in the origins of the Morgan dynasty. It all began with an American merchant from Danvers, Massachusetts, named George Peabody. In 1837, Peabody traveled to England as a bond salesman for the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, hoping to find British investors to replace the missing ranks of Americans who, because of the recession at that time, showed little interest in the project. He routinely was rejected by large investment houses of London, but eventually his persistence paid off. Stanley Jackson, in his biography of Morgan, says of Peabody, When the panic in the U.S. at last started to subside, he called time and time again to the big city barons in London's calling, to assure them that Maryland and other states would honor their bonds. He also continued backing American securities with his personal funds, buying at almost giveaway levels. He later reaped a rich harvest. He unloaded most of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal bonds and won a claim back home for returning his $60,000 commission intact to Maryland's meager treasury. It was during this trip that Peabody opened an import-export business at 22 Old Broad Street in London. He was importing, I can't remember, potato chips, and he was exporting, I can't remember. He began to provide loans and letters of credit to many of his shippers that moved him into the investment business, specializing in transactions between Britain and the United States. It was fortunate timing. This was the beginning of a period of rapid expansion in the United States, accompanied by an insatiable need for investment capital and a plethora of bond issues offering tantalizing rates of return, which were substantially higher than comparable offerings in Europe. Peabody's firm in an unusual position to exploit the expanding market, and his firm grew rapidly. Oh, yeah. Peabody never married, and he advanced in years, began to look for someone to carry on the business. The qualifications for such a position were difficult. First, the man had to be an American by birth in order to appear authentic as the representatives of American investments. Secondly, he had to be British by instinct and preference. This included being well educated and with good breeding in order to accept the aristocracy in London's financial world. Third, he had to have knowledge of Anglo-American finance. And fourth, Peabody had to like him. Janius Morgan, I'm going to skip ahead. Give me 1 second here. Okay, Morgan in the Panic of 1857. The Wall Street Panic of 1857, many U.S. buyers were unable to pay their bills, and Peabody and Morgan were expected to make good on their guarantees. Naturally, they didn't have the money, and the firm was facing certain bankruptcy unless the money could be obtained from somewhere. Stanley Jackson provides the details. The slump was catastrophic for Peabody and Company. It suddenly found itself committed to acceptance of £2 million and with no hope of discharging even part of the stockpile of depreciating bonds. The New York brokers and bankers, themselves now desperately short of ready funds, the firm was soon paying out thousands of pounds a day without raising a large temporary loan. The partners would be forced to suspend business altogether. Ron Chernow in the House of Morgan says rumors raced through London that George Peabody and the company was about to fail, the prospect heartily relished by rivals. The major London houses told Morgan that they would bail out the firm, but only if Peabody shut down the bank within a year. Jackson continued his narrative. The clouds lifted dramatically when the Bank of England announced a loan to Peabody of £800,000 at a very reasonable interest rate, with the promise of further funds up to £1 million sterling if they were required. It was a remarkable vote of confidence, as Thomas Hankey, who was the governor of the Bank of England, had already rejected similar appeals from various American firms who did not measure up to his standards. Peabody and Company recovered almost overnight and indeed hoisted its turnover above its pre-slump levels. With almost unlimited access to cash and credit backed by the Bank of England, Peabody and Morgan were able to wade hip deep through the depreciated stocks and bonds. They were sold to them at sacrifice prices on Wall Street within only a few years. When sanity had been restored to the American markets, the assets of the firm had grown to gigantic proportions. This event tells us a great deal about relationships. If the Rothschilds truly had been competitors, they would have seized upon this opportunity and used their great influence within the Bank of England, the other investment houses in London, to squeeze out Peabody and not assist him. The Barings, in particular, were already trying to accomplish exactly that. The Rothschilds must have believed that a successful Peabody firm ultimately would be in their own best interests. Here we go. It's going to get dicey. Anti-Semitism was profitable. In later years, Jack Morgan, JP Jr., would assume the role of a staunch anti-Semite. And this undoubtedly strengthened his hands with dealing with American investors and brokers who were loath to have anything to do with the Jewish bankers. That, of course, included officials of the U.S. Treasury. It was particularly helpful during the 1896 rescue of the federal government from a decline in its gold reserves. Fearing that it would not be able to honor its promise to exchange paper money for gold coins, the government was forced to borrow $62 million in gold, and the House of Rothschilds was an obvious source for such a loan. But the Treasury wanted to avoid an anti-Semitic backlash. Everything fell into place, however, when Morgan and Company became the primary lender with the Rothschilds, apparently demoted to the role of mere participant. Wheeler writes, the consummate politicians of the Cleveland administration were certainly aware of the dangers inherent in promoting a rescue effort for the United States Treasury that would be financed by those archetypes of international Jewish financiers, the Rothschilds. During these developments, Pierpont Morgan took no direct part in the salvage effort. Up to the point it looked as if the aging financier, he would be 58 pt8 in 2 months would be merely one among many of this and whatever subsequent bond arrangements would be necessary. It seemed as though he would move on into old age with little more to round out his obituary than his awkward attempt to profiteer from the sales of rifles at the start of the Civil War. His minor shortings of the Union in the gold trade towards the close, and a bold but largely unsuccessful move in the 1880s to impose an Eastern capitalist ceasefire on the country's warring railroads. But there were steps being taken even now to bring out of the financial backwaters, and there would not being taken by Pierpont Morgan himself. The first suggestion of his name for a role in recharging the reserve originated with the London branch of the House Rothschilds. The apparent anti-Semitism of J.P. Morgan Jr. was again extremely profitable during World War I, when it was widely publicized that the Kaiser was funded by German Jew bankers to deal with the Morgan Group, therefore, as opposed to the Kuhn-Loeb, for example, was in some circles almost a point of national patriotism. When J.P. Morgan Sr. died in 1913, people were shocked to learn that his estate was valued at only $68 million, a paltry sum compared to the fortunes held by the Vanderbilts. Anderson Cooper, I'm looking at you. The Astors, the Rockefellers, and even more unbelievable when Jack Morgan died in 1943 and left an estate valued at only $16 million. A small amount had been transferred to members of the family prior to their deaths, but this did not account for the vast fortunes which they visibly controlled during their lives. Surely there had been some kind of bookkeeping sleight of hand. On the other hand, it may have been true. When Alphonse Rothschild died in Paris in 1905, it was revealed that his estate contained $60 million in American securities. The Rothschilds in Britain undoubtedly held an equally large block. Furthermore, many of the securities were handled through the House of Morgan. And possibilities are obvious that a major portion of the wealth and the power of the Morgan family was and always had been merely the wealth and the power of the Rothschilds, who had raised it up at the beginning and who sustained it through its entire existence. How much of the Morgans' apparent anti-Semitism was real and how much of it may have been a pragmatic guise is in the final analysis of little importance, and we should not give unwarranted emphasis to it here. Regardless of one's interpretation of the nature of the relationship between houses of Morgan and Rothschild, the fact remains that it was close. It was ongoing, and it was profitable to both. If Morgan truly did harbor feelings of anti-Semitism, neither he nor Rothschilds ever allowed them to get in the way of their business. To put the London connection into proper perspective, it will be necessary again to abandon the strict chronological sequence of... Okay, I'm just going to jump ahead a little bit. Enough with all that. Okay, so England went into a depression. The problem, America was having prosperity at the time. And then there was another secret meeting, the secret meeting of 1927. All right, here we go. Okay, hold on a minute. The culmination of these discussions took place at a secret meeting in 1927, at which it was agreed that the financial lifeblood of the American people would be donated for a massive transfusion to Great Britain. Galbraith sets the scene. On July 1st, 1927, I don't know what this is. It's the name of a ship, I suppose. The Mauretania, something. the Kobayashi Maru, showed up. It arrived in New York with two notable passengers. Montague Norman, the governor of the Bank of England, and Hildmar Schacht, head of the German Reichsbank. The secrecy covering the visit was extreme and to a degree ostentatious. The names of neither of the great bankers appeared on the passenger list. Neither, on arriving, met with press. In New York, the two men were joined by Charles Rist, the deputy governor of the Banque de France. The Banque de France. They went to a conference with Benjamin Strong, the governor of the Federal Reserve of New York. The principal, or in any case the ultimate important subject of the discussion, was the persistently weak reserve position of the Bank of England. This, the bankers thought, could be helped if the Federal Reserve System would ease interest rates, encourage lending. Holders of the gold would then seek the higher return from keeping their metal in London. And in time, higher prices in the United States would ease the competitive position of British industry and labor. Galbraith speaks with soft phrases to cushion the harsh reality. What he's saying that the purpose of this meeting was to finalize a plan whereby the governor of the Federal Reserve System was to deliberately create inflation in the United States so that American prices would rise, making U.S. goods less competitive in world markets and causing American gold to move to the Bank of England. Governor Strong needed a little convincing. This was precisely what he and Norman had planned to do all along, and in fact, he already began to implement the plan. The purpose of inviting the Germans and the French to the meeting was to enlist their agreement to create inflation in their countries as well. Sacked in Rist would have no part of it and left the meeting early, leaving Strong and Norman to work out the final details between them. Strong was more concerned about the British fortune than American. In a letter written May of 1924, the Secretary of Treasury, Andrew Mellon, had discussed the necessity of lowering American interest rate as a step towards money expansion with the objective of raising American prices relative to those in Great Britain. He acknowledged that the goal was to protect England from having to cut back on wages, profits, and welfare. And he said, at the present time, it is probably true that the British prices for goods internationally dealt in are as a whole roughly in the neighborhood of 10% above our prices. And one of the preliminaries to the reestablishment of gold payment in Great Britain will be to facilitate a gradual readjustment of these price levels before monetary reform is undertaken. In other words, this means a small advance in prices here and possibly some small decline in their prices. The burden of the readjustment must fall more largely upon us than upon them. You can't just click a switch and fix the gas prices. You can't just click a switch and fix food. It would be difficult politically and socially for the British government and the Bank of England to face a price liquidation in England in the face of the fact that the trade is poor and they have over 1 million unemployed people receiving government aid. The Mandrake mechanism, the Federal Reserve, went into high gear on behalf of the Bank of England in 1924. Several years before the historic meeting between Strong, Norman, and Rist, there were two great surges of monetary expansion. The first came with the monetization of 492 million in bonds, plus almost twice as much bankers' acceptance. The second burst of inflation came in the later half of 27, immediately following the secret meeting of Strong, Norman, Schmacht, and Rist. It involved the funding of $225 million in government bonds plus $220 million in bankers' acceptances for a total increase in bank reserves of $445 million. At the same time, the rediscount rate to member banks, the interest rate that they pay to the borrowers from the Fed was lowered from 4 to 3.5%, making it easier for those banks to acquire additional, quote, reserves, unquote, out of which they could create even more fiat dollars. The amount created on top of that by the commercial bank is about 5.5 times the amount created by the Fed, which means a total money flood in excess of $10 billion in just 6 years. Throughout this period, the demand of the system of government bonds and accepted pushed interest rates down. As anticipated, people with gold then preferred to send it to London, where it could earn a higher yield. America's gold supply began to move abroad. Furthermore, as inflation began to eat its way into the purchasing power of the dollar, the prices of American-made goods then began to rise in world markets, making them less competitive. U.S. exports began to decline. Unemployment began to rise. Low interest rates and easy credit led to speculation in the securities market, and the system lunged full speed towards the Great Crash of 1929. But that part of the story must wait for another chapter. The technician who actually drafted the final version of the Federal Reserve Act was H. Parker Willis. After the system was created, he was appointed the first secretary of the Board of Governors. By 1929, he had become disillusioned with the cartel, and in an article published in North American Review, he wrote, "In the autumn of 1926, a group of bankers, among whom was one of the world's famous names, were sitting at a table in a Washington hotel. One of them raised the question whether the low discount rates of the system were not likely to encourage speculation. Yes, replied the conspicuous figure referred to. They will, but that cannot be helped. It is the price we must pay for helping Europe." There could be little doubt that the banker in question was J.P. Jack Morgan Jr. It was Jack who was imbued with the English tradition from the earliest age, whose financial empire had its roots in London, whose family business was saved by the Bank of England, who spent 6 months out of every year later in his life as a resident of England, who had openly assisted his junior partner demonstrate a loyalty to Britain, and who had directed the Council of Foreign Relations, the American branch of the secret society dedicated to the supremacy of the British tradition and political power. Whose only background that one can fully appreciate the willingness to sacrifice American interest. Indeed, it is the price we must pay for helping Europe. In spite of the growing signs of crisis in the American economy, Morgan's protege, Benjamin Strong, was nonetheless pleased with his accomplishment. In a letter written in 1929 to Parker Gilbert, who was the American agent for reparations, said, "Our policy of the last 4 years up to January had been effectively in accomplishing the purpose for which it was designed. It was enabled monetary reorganization to be completed in Europe, which otherwise would have been impossible. It was undertaken with the well-recognized hazard that we were liable to encounter a big speculation and some expansion of credit. Our course was perfectly obvious. We had to undertake it. The conditions permitted it, and the possibility of damage abroad was at a minimum." Damage abroad? What about damage at home? It is clear that Strong saw little difference between the two. He was the forerunner of the internationalists who have operated the Federal Reserve ever since. He viewed the United States as but one piece of the complex world financial structure. And that was good for the world. He was good for America. And oh yes, that was what was good for England was good for the world. After the Civil War, America experienced a series of expansions and contractions of the money supply, leading directly to economic booms and busts. This was the result of a creation of fiat money by a banking system which, far from being free and competitive, was a halfway house to central banking. Throughout the chaos, one banking firm, the House Morgan, was able to prosper out of the failure of others. Morgan had close ties with the financial structure and the culture of England, and was in fact more British than American. Events suggested the possibility that Morgan and Company was in a concealed partnership with the House of Rothschild. Throughout most of this period, Benjamin Strong was a Morgan man and was appointed the first governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which rapidly assumed dominance over the system. Strong immediately entered into close alliance with Montague Norman, governor of the Bank of England, to save the English economy from depression. This was accomplished by deliberately creating inflation in the U.S., which caused an outflow of gold, a loss of foreign markets, unemployment, and speculation in the stock market, all of which were factors that propelled America into the crash of 1929 and the Great Depression of the 1930s. Although not covered in this chapter, it must be remembered that the same forces were responsible for the American involvement in both wars to provide the economic and military resources England needed to survive. Furthermore, the key players in this action were men who were part of the network of a secret society established by Cecil Rhodes for an expansion of the British Empire. Today's episode was brought to you by the inverted 7 of coins. Sorry this episode is a little bit shorter than normal. I'm getting ready to go on a little vacation out of town this weekend and had to get this wrapped up, and I still got a lot of packing stuff to do. So I apologize, but I feel kind of proud that I was able to get one of these out on time. So this has been the Abracast, and I've been John Towers. If you guys got Hulu, look for that thing. I believe it just came out, so they might be pumping it, like they might be promoting it. But it's all about GameStop, and I mean, you probably remember all this that happened a few years ago. A bunch of normal dudes and chicks, a bunch of normal dudes and chicks. Started using day trading to assault and squeeze hedge fund, these big giant hedge funds that were moving on this used video game store. It's an amazing and fascinating story, and the stuff they get some of these people to say is pretty amazing in this thing. And you're like, I don't even like video games, bro. Come on, I don't even like video games. Like, think about it as a David and Goliath story then. Maybe you like that. Anyhow, I'm John. This is the Abracast. I'm going camping, and I'll let Hilla tell you everything else.
Thank you for listening, and we hope that you enjoyed the show. Please send an email or find us on social media and let us know what you think about the show. We would appreciate it if you would give us a 5-star rate and review wherever you find your favorite podcasts. You can find Stigmata Studios, graphic, novels, and comic books. Take control of your destiny. Understand your past. Put your present in context and know your future with a twist. Check out the Abracast Tarot Card Deck. Your body is your temple. So let's make sure you got a badass t-shirt on it. Variety of cool themed t-shirts. And other merch like stickers, wall art, mugs, and more. Welcome to the Red Archive. get access to over 50 hours of archived episodes, more bonus audio, additional exclusive content. All this for only $1 a month. Are you interested in the occult, history, conspiracy, and violence? Learn more at Abracast.com.